Imagine a massive Category 5 hurricane churning right in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, a truly terrifying scenario for anyone on the coast.
Exactly. And the only reason your local mayor knows whether to issue a mandatory evacuation for your specific town rather than a town 50 miles down the road is because of millions of lines of highly complex mathematical code.
Right. It's code most of us never even think about.
We really don't. But that code is essentially a predictive engine.
Right.
And it's been built and refined over decades by quiet, invisible, and just relentless scientific research.
Absolutely.
It's that exact same invisible machinery that, detects an emerging viral strain before it becomes a pandemic, or designs the shielding that protects satellites from solar flares.
It's the foundation of modern safety.
Right. But what happens if the government decides to just stop upgrading that engine? What happens when the money that funds the very foundation of American scientific discovery is radically redirected?
That is the big question right now.
Welcome to Meteorology Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the science, chaos, and stories behind the weather that shapes our world.
This show was created by meteorologist Rob Jones.
Now let's get into today's episode of Meteorology Matters.
We have a lot to cover today.
We really do. But before we go any further, make sure you follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram @meteorologist, on TikTok @TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, follow Rob Jones Hurricane, where you can also find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist.
And please take a moment to like, follow, comment, and rate the podcast.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference and helps us keep bringing this kind of analysis right to your feed.
So getting into it.
Right. I want to set a very clear ground rule for our discussion today. We're looking at comprehensive data and policy documents regarding the incoming administration's proposed 2027 federal budget cuts to major science agencies.
Important context there.
Very important. I want to be absolutely clear. In this episode, we are not taking any political sides.
Right. Zero politics from us.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing the viewpoints of the researchers who compile these reports, nor are we endorsing the policies or viewpoints of the administration proposing them.
We're just looking at the facts.
Purely analytical. We're here to impartially report on the raw data, unpack the proposed structural changes, and examine the scientific community's response. We're looking at the mechanics of policy and what it means for the machinery of science.
And, I think that's the most productive way to approach this. When you strip away all the partisan rhetoric, you're left with a massive, unprecedented structural shift in how the United States government intends to acquire and utilize knowledge.
Yeah.
We're looking at what happens structurally when a government attempts to pivot its funding priorities away from broad, long-term scientific research and redirects that capital toward immediate operational capabilities and national defense.
Which is a huge pivot.
It really is. We'll examine this philosophy across several federal agencies to understand the macro trend, but we're going to place a special, highly detailed focus on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Which we'll refer to as NOAA throughout our discussion today, right?
Exactly, NOAA.
So let's start with that 30,000-foot macro view, because you really can't understand the specific impacts on weather forecasting without understanding the overarching philosophy of this 2027 budget proposal.
You really have to see the big picture first.
Right. The data shows a profound recalibration of federal discretionary spending. The proposal outlines a 40% increase for defense spending.
40%.
Yeah, a massive jump. That brings the military budget to a staggering $1.5 trillion. And to balance that equation, non-defense programs would drop by 10% across the board.
But that 10% is an average, right?
Exactly. When you zoom in on the major science agencies, that 10% average obscures some incredibly steep cuts.
The numbers for the major scientific institutions are, they're truly historic in their scope. Let's look at the National Science Foundation, the NSF.
What are we seeing there?
It is slated for a reduction of nearly 55%, bringing its budget down to $4 billion. Wow, over half.
Yeah. Then the EPA faces a 52% reduction. That brings them down to $4.2 billion.
Another huge cut.
Right. NASA would see a 23% reduction, down to $18.8 billion. And the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, would drop by roughly 12 to 13%.
Bringing its operational budget to, $41.3 billion.
Spot on, $41.3 billion.
So the administration has been very explicit about their goal with these numbers. It's not just about saving money. It's about recalibrating scarce funding toward what they define as top national priorities.
Right. They have specific targets in mind.
They do. They specifically list promoting immediate health solutions, applying artificial intelligence, and advancing quantum computing.
Which all sound like science initiatives.
They do. But the mechanism of how they plan to achieve this is what's catching the scientific community totally off guard. They plan to fund these priorities by increasing applied research within the defense and energy departments.
While simultaneously cutting it elsewhere. Exactly. Cutting basic AI and quantum research at the National Science Foundation by 32 and 37%, respectively.
Wow.
Okay, let's unpack this. I'm trying to visualize this. Is this like taking all the seed corn out of the community greenhouse, the place where anyone can use it to experiment and grow a vast variety of crops over time, and moving it exclusively into the military armory to only grow rations for the troops? And actually, before we go further, let's clarify for the listener the vital difference between basic research, which is what the NSF handles, and applied research.
Your seed corn analogy is actually a perfect representation of the mechanism at play here. Let's break down that fundamental difference because it's the absolute crux of this entire budget philosophy.
Right.
Basic research is the pure pursuit of fundamental knowledge. It's scientists asking, how does this physical property of the universe work? Without having any commercial product or immediate defense application in mind.
Just curiosity-driven.
Exactly. Basic research is the foundation of everything. It's the discovery of the electron in the late 1890s. When J.J. Thomson discovered the electron, he wasn't trying to build a smartphone or a flat-screen television.
He was just doing lab work.
Right. He was just trying to understand the nature of cathode rays. But you literally cannot have modern electronics, computers, or the internet without that basic research occurring first.
Right. And applied research is taking that foundational discovery and putting it to work.
Exactly. Applied research takes that fundamental knowledge and tries to solve a specific, immediate problem.
Like using the electron discovery.
Yes. It's taking the understanding of the electron and building a better lithium-ion battery for an electric vehicle, or designing a new semiconductor for a missile guidance system.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the administration's budget reflects a clear, targeted desire to rein in domestic spending. They want to eliminate programs they view as bloated, wasteful, or ideologically driven.
Do they give examples of that?
Yeah. For example, the budget proposes completely eliminating the NSF's Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate.
Completely eliminating it.
Entirely. The administration's argument is straightforward. This saves taxpayer dollars and focuses capital entirely on immediate national security technologies.
Right. Their perspective is, why spend millions studying abstract behavioral models when you could spend that money building a better drone swarm using applied AI?
That's their exact stance.
But researchers are pointing out that this creates a massive long-term vulnerability. Their stance is that you can't have applied technological breakthroughs in AI or quantum computing 10 years from now if you stop funding the fundamental basic physics and mathematics research today.
And that is the core of the scientific community's pushback. They argue that basic and applied research aren't two separate buckets.
They're connected.
They're a continuous pipeline. A great historical example is the mRNA technology used in the COVID-19 vaccines.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. That didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2020. It was the result of decades of basic, often very obscure, federally funded research into how messenger RNA interacts with human cells.
It was just foundational biology for years.
Exactly, for years. If you had cut that basic research in the 1990s because it didn't have an immediate applied use, the applied vaccine couldn't have been developed when we desperately needed it.
So you cut the pipeline, you lose the product.
The scientific consensus is that if you cut the basic research pipeline today, the output of applied technology will inevitably run dry a decade down the line.
That tension-sacrificing, broad, foundational understanding for immediate operational application. It sets the stage perfectly for what's happening with weather forecasting.
Yeah, it really does.
We have this macro trend of cutting basic research across the board. Now, let's apply this exact philosophy to the agency that affects our daily lives, our safety, and our economy the most. NOAA.
Right, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Yes, exactly. NOAA faces a 28% funding reduction in this proposal. That brings their budget down to roughly $4.46 billion.
Which is a massive hit.
It is. But looking at the data, this isn't just a financial haircut. They aren't just asking everyone to tighten their belts. It's a complete structural transformation.
How so?
The proposal entirely eliminates the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, or OAR. By doing this, the administration moves NOAA away from scientific advancement and transforms it into a purely operational agency.
Yeah, the elimination of OAR is the defining feature of this budget regarding meteorology.
It's a huge deal.
OAR isn't just a side project. It is the absolute backbone of United States meteorological advancement. The people working there don't just report the weather. They literally build the complex mathematical tools that allow us to predict it.
So they build the models?
They do.
Yeah.
OAR is responsible for developing our numerical weather prediction models. They research the mechanics of hurricane rapid intensification.
Which has become so critical lately.
Absolutely vital. They build the data assimilation techniques that make satellite information usable. They conduct the long-term climate modeling that agriculture and urban planners rely on.
So why cut them?
The administration's stated goal for eliminating this office is to target broad climate research and programs they label as Green New Scam initiatives.
I see.
They believe these programs are overly politicized and tangential to the agency's core mission, which they view as just telling Americans what the weather is going to do today.
But the reality of eliminating OAR is that it removes the entire research and development arm of the agency.
Exactly.
Oh, wait, hold on. Here's where it gets really interesting. I'm going to push back on this on behalf of the average taxpayer listening right now.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I look at my phone right now, the weather app works perfectly. It tells me exactly when the rain is going to start. It gives me a highly accurate 10-day forecast, and it warns me if there's a severe thunderstorm approaching.
It's pretty amazing technology.
Right. So why on earth do we need a billion-dollar research office just to keep doing what my phone already does so well?
Yeah.
If the day-to-day operations are preserved and the weather stations are still running, why should the average citizen care if the research arm is gone?
It's an incredibly common and honestly understandable perspective, but it fundamentally misunderstands how modern meteorology works.
Okay, explain that.
The research community uses a brilliant analogy to answer this. The fiscal year 2027 proposal prioritizes maintaining the car, meaning running the daily forecast that's keeping the servers on, but it completely stops upgrading the engine.
Stopping OAR is stopping the engine upgrade.
Exactly. Right now, your weather app works beautifully because of decades of continuous, relentless upgrades to that underlying engine. Modern weather forecasting is not a static set-it-and-forget-it process.
It's always evolving.
Constantly. We are continually launching new, highly advanced satellites and building next-generation phased-array radar systems. These systems produce a massive fire hose of new data every single second.
Right.
But the operational computers don't magically know how to read that new data. You need OAR researchers to write new code, test new fluid dynamics, physics equations, and build new artificial intelligence algorithms just to handle the influx of information.
So if you don't upgrade the engine,
If you stop upgrading the engine, your car will keep running for a while, sure. But eventually, the components will become obsolete, the processing will stagnate, and the daily forecasts will fall severely behind the capabilities of modern technology.
let's pull on that thread, because if the engine of American weather forecasting stops improving, we need to explore exactly what happens when those improvements stall out in the real world.
The real-world stakes are high.
What are the tangible stakes for the listener? If we look backward for a moment, over the past 50 years, fatalities from severe weather have steadily and drastically decreased in the United States.
A huge success story.
It really is. And if you look specifically at hurricanes, the track errors, meaning the distance between where we predict the hurricane will hit versus where it actually hits, have been reduced by roughly 50% since the 1990s.
Which saves countless lives.
Countless. And the data is explicit here. This progress wasn't just a byproduct of running day-to-day operations longer. It was strictly due to dedicated long-term research investments in atmospheric physics.
To put that in perspective, the weather models we relied on in the 1990s would be considered practically primitive today.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Back then, the models divided the Earth's atmosphere into grid boxes that were tens of kilometers wide.
That's chunky.
Very chunky. Today, thanks entirely to OAR's research into supercomputing efficiency and atmospheric physics, those grid boxes are incredibly small and high resolution. That's why we can pinpoint a storm's path with such accuracy.
So without OAR,
If OAR is eliminated, future advancements in predicting rapid hurricane intensification will stall out. We've seen storms recently jump from a Category 1 to a Category 4 in under 24 hours.
yeah, we've seen that a lot lately.
Predicting that specific phenomenon requires cutting-edge research. High-resolution tornado modeling, which gives communities precious extra minutes of warning time before a tornado touches down, will stagnate.
And those minutes mean the difference between life and death.
Exactly. And critically, the integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning into operational forecasting will come to a dead halt right at the exact moment when the rest of the global technology sector is accelerating.
Trying to predict severe weather feels a bit like trying to predict the exact path of a pinball. But the table itself, the global climate keeps tilting, and the bumpers keep changing their positions.
That's a really good way to visualize it.
If we start building better predictive algorithms to map out that constantly changing table, we're essentially just guessing in the dark. And the economic impacts of that stagnation are massive.
It goes way beyond ruined weekend plans.
Way beyond. This isn't just about whether your picnic gets rained out. Stagnant forecasts directly threaten the broader United States economy.
Think about aviation safety.
Exactly. Commercial airlines rely on highly precise, constantly updated upper-level wind models to route flights safely around turbulence and efficiently ride the jet stream.
Which saves millions of gallons of jet fuel.
And agricultural planning relies heavily on accurate seasonal forecasts to determine planting and harvesting times. Emergency management agencies at the state and federal level rely on precise, severe weather warnings to pre-position resources.
That costs millions of dollars per deployment, so they need to be accurate.
Precisely. Even energy markets depend on hyper-accurate temperature forecasts to predict natural gas and power grid demand ahead of a massive cold snap.
Plus, long-term seasonal forecasts, like predicting the El Niño Southern Oscillation and developing drought outlooks for the West Coast, will be severely degraded.
It's all connected.
You mentioned the predictive algorithms earlier, and I want to dive deep into the what and the why of a specific concept called data assimilation.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because this is the absolute core of what OAR researchers do, and it's the exact capability we lose if they are defunded. Data assimilation is the brutally complex science of taking raw data from the real world and translating it into a mathematical format that a supercomputer model can actually understand.
How does that actually work?
Imagine dividing the entire Earth's atmosphere into a grid of tiny three-dimensional boxes, millions and millions of them, stacking from the surface all the way up to the stratosphere.
All right, so visualizing the boxes.
Inside each one of those boxes, the computer model needs to know the exact temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind speed.
So it's constantly crunching those numbers.
Right. Now, let's say we have a highly sophisticated satellite orbiting 300 miles above the Earth. That satellite doesn't actually measure temperature in degrees Fahrenheit.
It doesn't.
No, it measures microscopic variations in microwave radiation bouncing off oxygen molecules.
Oh, wow.
Data assimilation is the process where researchers build an algorithm that takes that specific microwave radiance reading from a satellite moving 17,000 miles an hour, translates it into a temperature reading, and slots it into the exact right 3D box in the model.
Without breaking the math.
Exactly, without mathematically crashing the fluid dynamics equations of the box right next to it.
That is incredibly complex. So without the researchers doing that translation work, the satellite is basically useless.
Exactly. We have these incredible instruments, but raw data is useless on its own. If you defund the research arm, we will have literal fire hoses of new atmospheric data from billions of dollars worth of satellites.
But we won't know what to do with it.
We simply won't know how to feed that data into our models. The satellite essentially becomes a very expensive orbiting camera. Without data assimilation research, the operational models become blind to the very data they need to keep you safe.
If the United States stops upgrading its weather engine and loses the ability to assimilate this data, we have to look at how that affects our standing globally.
It's a real concern.
What happens to the mechanics who are currently building that engine? Where do they go? The data indicates that we are already in a highly competitive global forecasting race.
We definitely are.
The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, the ECMWF, already consistently outperforms United States models in medium-range forecasting.
Hurricane Sandy is the classic example meteorologists always point to.
Right. Days before landfall, the European model accurately predicted Sandy would take that bizarre, devastating left hook into New Jersey.
While the American model initially showed it harmlessly floating out to sea.
The primary reason Europe consistently has the edge is that they invest heavily in centralized, hyper-focused research and massive supercomputing power entirely dedicated to weather.
It's their priority.
If NOAA research is eliminated in the U.S., we may be forced to rely much more heavily on foreign models. This would shift the leadership of global forecasting entirely to the international community.
This raises an important question regarding the human toll of these structural shifts.
The actual people doing the work.
Exactly. Eliminating OAR and slashing agency budgets isn't just about turning off computers. It leads to severe, immediate staffing shortages.
Because the funding is gone.
Right. The operational forecasters who remain at their desks face massively increased workloads. They are asked to do more with older tools. This leads to a high risk of burnout.
Which is dangerous.
And when you strain your operational staff to the breaking point, you indirectly degrade the quality of the forecasts today, even if the servers are still running perfectly. Human judgment is still a massive part of issuing a tornado warning.
That inevitably brings up the risk of a massive brain drain. If the United States government completely defunds this specialized meteorological research, where do all these brilliant atmospheric physicists, mathematicians, and climate scientists go?
They have to go somewhere.
Do they pack up and move to Europe to work for the CMWF? Do they go to private tech companies or Wall Street hedge funds that need weather modeling for commodities trading?
The reality of the scientific community is that these individuals have highly specialized, incredibly niche PhDs. They will go wherever the funding allows them to continue their life's work.
They won't just switch careers.
No, they aren't going to suddenly start working in applied defense technology. Their expertise is the atmosphere. The research we're reviewing quotes a glaciologist from the University of Pennsylvania who stated, "This is how the U.S. loses its scientific leadership with a reckless budget line."
That's a powerful quote.
The ecosystem of American scientific leadership is highly fragile. It takes decades to build a world-class research institution, but you can dismantle it in a single budget cycle.
It's so precarious.
Consider the critical ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico. This isn't just a body of water. It is a highly complex, dynamic region where deep ocean loop currents and atmospheric conditions interact to spawn some of the most destructive storms on the planet.
Right.
OAR funds researchers whose entire careers are dedicated to studying exactly how a layer of warm water sitting 80 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico can suddenly interact with the atmosphere and turn a tropical storm into a Category 5 monster overnight.
We saw that happen recently.
Yes.
Yep.
Losing the researchers dedicated to that specific, localized ocean-atmosphere interaction could leave the entire coastal United States highly vulnerable.
Without specialized research, our ability to anticipate the unique, changing behavior of storms in that specific basin will rapidly degrade.
That's the bottom line.
The profound cuts at NOAA and the potential loss of that localized expertise are staggering. But as we noted at the beginning, they are just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Just one agency among many.
That exact same philosophy,
Yeah.
sacrificing broad foundational understanding for immediate application and deregulation, isn't just happening in our oceans. It's happening in orbit, in our hospitals, and in our environment.
It's a government-wide shift.
Let's look at NASA. The space agency faces a massive 47% drop in funding, specifically targeted at its science division.
47%.
Yeah. This proposed cut would immediately terminate over 40 ongoing projects. We're talking about Earth-observing satellites that monitor soil moisture for farmers, planetary defense telescopes that track near-Earth asteroids, and foundational astrophysics research.
It's sweeping.
Space advocates in the research documents refer to this as an extinction-level event for science that would effectively prevent NASA from remaining the world leader in space exploration. It shifts NASA from an agency of scientific discovery to an agency strictly focused on operational lunar or Martian logistics.
And the health sector faces an equally dramatic structural upheaval.
Right. Let's talk about the NIH.
The National Institutes of Health would see an overall 13% budget drop. But the raw percentage cut isn't the biggest story here.
It's the structure.
More significantly, the administration is proposing a massive structural redesign of how the NIH operates and funds research. They want to force the agency to move to forward or multi-year funding.
What does that mean in practice?
To understand why this is a big deal, you have to look at the mechanics of a university research lab. Currently, if a scientist gets a major grant, like an R01 grant to study a new cancer mechanism, the NIH might agree to fund it for 5 years, but they pay out that money annually.
Year by year.
Right. The new proposal caps the total amount paid out and forces grants to be fully funded upfront in a single budget year.
Oh, weird.
Critics point out that this mechanism will drastically limit the total number of new grants the NIH can support in any given year.
Because they have to pay it all at once.
Exactly. If a university lab can't rely on a steady pipeline of new grants, they can't hire long-term postdoctoral researchers, and entire avenues of medical investigation just stop.
And what about the CDC?
Additionally, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, would take a massive 41% cut.
41%.
Yes, and the proposal suggests moving many of its core operational programs into a new umbrella organization called the Administration for a Healthy America.
Interesting name.
The policy researchers note this restructuring would result in huge, immediate cuts to public health staples like HIV prevention, viral hepatitis programs, and long-term chronic disease research.
And then there's the EPA. The EPA is slated to be slashed by 52%.
More than half.
The administration's stated goal for this reduction is to eliminate what it specifically calls woke environmental justice work and overly precautionary modeling.
It's defined what that modeling actually is.
Right. Precautionary modeling is essentially how the agency determines the potential long-term health risks of a new chemical before it's released into the market, or how a new industrial facility might impact the air quality of the surrounding local community.
It's safety research.
It is, but the administration views this as burdensome red tape that slows down economic growth and industrial expansion.
It's a very different set of priorities.
Looking at all of this together, it feels very much like the government is aggressively pruning a massive, sprawling garden. They want to focus all the water and fertilizer solely on a few specific high-yield crops, like defense technology and applied AI.
But in the aggressive process of pruning, they're pulling up the deep roots of everything else.
The roots of space exploration, public health, and environmental safety. So what does this all mean for the future of American innovation?
Synthesizing the broad impact requires us to look impartially at both primary arguments.
Let's hear them.
The administration is heavily prioritizing immediate defense capabilities, technological dominance in applied fields, and broad economic deregulation.
Their argument is fundamentally economic and strategic, right?
It is. They argue this approach saves the taxpayer money, cuts what they perceive as ideological waste in the federal bureaucracy, and streamlines the government to focus strictly on tangible, immediate threats.
So they see the current system as inefficient.
They believe the current research system is bloated, unfocused, and detached from the immediate needs of the nation.
Conversely, patient advocacy groups, environmental organizations, and broad scientific coalitions argue that pulling up these foundational roots will ultimately stymie treatments for future diseases.
And blind us to environmental hazards.
Exactly, and cripple American competitiveness against global adversaries like China and Europe, who are heavily investing in basic research.
They believe that foundational, curiosity-driven research is the only proven way to ensure long-term national security, economic prosperity, and public health.
The core tension we are looking at is the choice between short-term fiscal contraction and long-term scientific investment.
And that tension bleeds into the final piece of the puzzle. We have to look at the economics of scientific publishing.
Which is a whole other issue.
Because even for the applied research that does manage to get funded under this new paradigm, the administration is proposing a radical change in how that information is ultimately shared with the world.
The budget proposal includes language that explicitly prohibits spending federal funds on expensive subscriptions to academic journals and prohibitively high publishing costs.
They want to stop paying for it entirely.
The administration argues that the current academic publishing model effectively charges the government and the taxpayer twice. First, the government uses tax dollars to fund the actual research experiment in the lab.
And
Then, when the scientist goes to publish their findings, the journal charges a publication fee. And finally, the journal charges the government agencies exorbitant subscription fees just to access and read the very research they funded in the first place.
So it's a closed loop of fees.
To combat this, the administration is pushing for a mandate to use low-cost outlets to make all federally funded research publicly available.
The scientific publishing community, which in these documents represents roughly 160 different publishers, calls this move baffling and deeply concerning.
Why are they so concerned?
To understand their perspective, you have to understand article processing charges, known as APCs. When a scientist submits a paper to a major journal, they often have to pay an APC.
How much is that?
Which can range anywhere from $3,000 to over $10,000 per article.
Wow, that's a lot for one paper.
It is. The publishers argue that these APCs aren't just arbitrary profit margins. They actually fund the highly complex, rigorous peer review process.
Right, checking the facts.
Peer review requires managing editors, formatting, database maintenance, and organizing independent experts to verify the data. The publishers stress that rigorous, well-funded peer review is more critical right now than at any point in history.
Because of AI.
Yes, this is specifically due to the...
If my tax dollars fund the research grant, shouldn't I be able to read the final paper for free? Why should federal money go to wealthy academic journals just to place that taxpayer-funded research behind an expensive paywall that only universities can afford to bypass?
It's a highly compelling argument. What's fascinating here is the deep tension between the democratization of open access and the necessity of quality control.
It's a tough balance.
It is an incredibly complex economic ecosystem. Capping federal payments for publishing fees might indeed democratize access for the public in the short term. Anyone with an internet connection could read the papers.
Which sounds good on the surface.
However, researchers worry it will create a severe systemic inequity within the scientific community itself. Think about the mechanics of this. If the government refuses to let grant money pay for publishing fees, then only well-funded scientists, or those backed by immense private wealth or corporate sponsorships, will be able to afford the out-of-pocket costs to publish their findings in the most prestigious, high-impact journals.
Like Nature or Science.
Exactly. The high-impact journals require extensive, expensive peer review. If we fracture this established system of scientific validation, we risk creating a tiered system.
I see what you mean.
We could enter a paradigm where the visibility and perceived quality of the science is determined entirely by the personal or corporate wealth of the researcher, rather than the rigor and validity of the data itself.
That's a scary thought. This entire discussion into the 2027 budget research leaves us looking at a very different potential future for American science.
A completely different landscape.
The structural shifts proposed here, cutting basic science for applied defense, dismantling the research arm of the Weather Service, redesigning health grants and defunding the publishing model, they are not just minor bureaucratic adjustments.
No, they represent foundational redesigns of how knowledge is acquired, verified, and utilized by the state.
Which brings us to a critical final thought for you to consider long after this discussion ends.
A question to ponder.
If the federal government intentionally steps back from funding basic, long-term scientific research and the foundational infrastructure of discovery, if they purposefully defund the engines that drive our predictive models and medical breakthroughs, who steps in to fill that massive void?
Does the private sector, driven by billionaires and multinational corporations, take over the mantle of scientific discovery?
And if they do, what happens when the predictive weather data that keeps your family safe from a hurricane, or the fundamental genetic research that cures a disease, is owned entirely by a private corporation focused on shareholder profit, rather than a public institution focused on the common good?
It's definitely something to think about.
You've been listening to Meteorology Matters, created by meteorologist Rob Jones.
Thanks for listening, and remember, meteorology always matters.